We're now in public session. At the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane safe or flight mode depending on their device. It's not sufficient to just put your phone on silent. This will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Item number 6 on the agenda today is child and family homelessness. I would like to welcome to today's meeting from Focus Ireland Mr Mike Allen and Ms Niamh Lamb from the Children's Rights Alliance, Ms Saoirse Brady and Ms Adele Quinn from the Ombudsman for Children's Office, Dr Niall Muldoon and Dr Karen McCauley from the Mercy Law Resource Centre, and Ms Rebecca Keating and Mr Paul Doran. Before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on or criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I'd now like to call on Mr Mike Allen to make his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the committee for the invitation. Thanks for the invitation to address the committee about this important issue. A large part of, I think, of what we're going to be talking about is the report from the Children's Ombudsman in relation to the family hubs. And the first point we'd like to make about that is that well, we very much welcome the report and think it's a very substantive and wise contribution to the debate, mixing the voice of the children who are experiencing homelessness with the questions on policy or the absence of it. It's really important for the committee to remember that what that report is looking at is the very best of what we offer for families who are homeless. The family hubs are a specific outcome of policy. The vast majority of families who are homeless are experiencing a level of accommodation and a level of support which is much, much lower than that. And I think that we've really got to keep our attention on that. It brings us to a point where we must not be sort of thinking about spend all our time thinking about what is the best form of hub and what is the best form of emergency accommodation. This committee, more than any other, needs to be addressing the question of what is the real answer to homelessness, which is getting an adequate supply of homes. I think that the discussion around the hubs and the way in which the Ombudsman for Children's report highlights the absence of policy behind it, highlights something which is true of all the way through the homeless crisis, that every stage of the way the problems have been addressed simply by saying that one form of intervention is better than another. So if somebody's lying on the side of the street with no food and no cover, it's better if somebody comes along and gives them soup. And once they've got the soup, it would be better that somebody came along and gave them a free sleeping bag. And if they get a sleeping bag, it would be better that they had some form of accommodation and were in a dormitory with 10 other people, some of whom are on drugs. Each of those is better than the other, and arguably better than the other. And so similarly, having families living in one-room hotel rooms is unacceptable, and hubs are better than that. But better than is not a policy. So if a voluntary organisation says that handing somebody a sandwich is better than them going hungry, that's fine because that's voluntary activity and is a humanitarian response. We quite reasonably expect better than that in terms of policy from the state, in terms of the way it addresses this issue. So when we look at hubs, we have to say, well, what is the analysis of the problem which has gone into that proposal to put hubs in place, and in what sense is a hub a response to that, and how will we know whether it works? And there's a complete vacuum in that. So the two issues we've highlighted in the report which relate to that are, one is what impact is the hub meant to have on the duration of which families are homeless? I think we all agree that we would like to live in a world in which no family was homeless. But we're in the middle of a crisis, so the sort of questions we need to ask is, how long Are we willing to put up that certain families remain homeless? And the most recent figures that were published, which were from March this year, said that there were 167 families that were homeless for more than 2 years. Now, is it policy that those families should be in hubs because they provide a better form of accommodation? Or is the policy that they should be in hotel rooms because of some other reason? Do we expect the families in hubs to move on more quickly? Or do we expect them to move on more slowly because they've got higher levels of problems? These are not complicated questions. These are the basic questions that anybody addressing the issue of homelessness should have asked on day one. We don't know the answer. So what are we doing about the fact that those families are so long homeless, and that we absolutely know the utter destruction to the lives of that family as a family unit protected by our Constitution, and the children in that family also protected by our Constitution, and yet we've allowed that to grow, and it's in the report year after year over the last period of time. What is our policy to address that, and how do the hubs fit into that, and how does the rest of it fit into that? And secondly, we have an absolute concentration from government and elsewhere, and we have played a part in this, I'll acknowledge that, on just numbers. So every time the homeless figures come out, and mostly they go upwards, the government says X number of families have moved out of homelessness. If we concentrate only on getting the maximum number of families out of homelessness every month, so that we can have a press release on that, the inevitable result of that is the families with the highest degree of social problem, who are the hardest to support sustainably out of homeless, will become the ones who remain longest. So when we finally reach the end of this crisis, and there are enough homes, we will then be in a situation where there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of families whose capacity to operate independently as a family has been entirely undermined by years and years living in institutions. Even aside from the housing, that is a problem that we can address. And the absolute absence of any government policy to even acknowledge that as an issue, or to say how it is to be addressed, is shocking, has to remain shocking, and is solvable as the whole problem. The last, similarly, in the way in which policy develops, Fergus O'Dowd is recognised over 30 years as having expertise in dealing with family homelessness. It's in the report. I won't go through all the details of what we've done, but we are recognised by every local authority and by government as having that. We have argued consistently that there needs to be a case manager and a child support worker for every family that needs it. Currently, the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive is responding to that in a way which may be positive, which is that they are recruiting up to 25 case managers to work directly, to be employed by them, to work directly with the families who are homeless, at a higher wage level than they are willing to pay us to employ staff to do the same thing. There is nowhere I have seen where it is explained why this is a good shift to make. It has been the policy of government and local authorities for the last at least 10 years that specialised groups are better at delivering this group, and that's why there's subcontract organisations like Fergus O'Dowd to work with children, Simon, Peter McVerry Trust, DePaul and so on to work with other homeless people, because we have that expertise. So there's a very substantial shift involving a budget of over €1 million to doing that directly. It may, I'm not criticising it, let's make absolutely clear, I am criticising that I haven't seen a single piece of paper which explains why that's a better use of public money and what benefits it's going to provide for the families, for their children, or on the homelessness or taxation issue. And it's yet another area where policy is being developed. We call it policy, but there is no policy behind it. And the last point I make, since this is the Housing Committee, is the concentration is going to be obviously on this issue of managing homelessness, but it is housing that is the solution. And there's a figure that surprised me in the fiscal report which came out yesterday. The government is projecting that by 2023 there will be 48,000 housing completions which will reach this sort of peak. Now, I'm sure the members of the committee will have views as to where the 48,000 figure came from, and the realism of it came from the Department of Housing. But if that's the government's aspiration that we'll reach 48,000 new completions in 2023, that's the first indicator that at that point the problem of homelessness will stop getting worse. So we can assume that the problem of homelessness, that is, there are too few homes for the people who need them, will continue to get worse, even on the government's most optimistic statement. it won't start to even stop getting worse until 2023. That is a very, very serious situation in terms of the pressure that is on homeless services and particularly on homeless families, and the total absence of any coherent policy to deal with family homelessness as a distinct problem from the general one of homelessness.
I'd now call on Ms Saoirse Brady from the Children's Rights Alliance.
I'm actually going to split my time with my colleague Adele Quinn, so she will start and I will finish.
Right. Thanks, Ms Quinn.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to present to you here today. Just to say a quick word about the Alliance, we unite over 100 member organisations working to make Ireland one of the best places in the world to be a child. Children under the age of 18 experience the steepest rise in homelessness of any age group over the last 5 years, with children under 4 making up the largest cohort of children living in emergency accommodation. As a society, I think we can agree that this is unacceptable. Young parents aged 18 to 24 make up almost 1 in 4 families in Dublin experiencing homelessness. And outside of Dublin, we often think of this as a Dublin problem, but outside of Dublin, the problem of child and family homelessness is also increasing. We have almost 500 families with over 1,000 children in emergency accommodation just 2 months ago. Those figures are from April. The report card is the Children's Rights Alliance annual flagship publication, and it is our tool for identifying serious issues for children. It examines the government's own commitments to children and its programme for government. This year in our report card, the government received an F, or fail, for child and family homelessness. And this is due to the ongoing phenomenon of child and family homelessness and the failure of government to embrace strategies that will reduce the number of children living in emergency accommodation. I briefly want to paint a picture of what living in emergency accommodation is like for children today. First of all, what is a home? A home should be a warm, secure and safe place for children. But what we saw in our study, we released a report last year called Homeworks on the educational needs of children experiencing homelessness. And what that showed us is that these children, they wake up in the morning, often really early, like 5:30, so that they can make a long journey to school, because they're often in emergency accommodation that is much further away from their schools. They wake up in one room, which they share with family, with their parents and siblings. Because there's a lack of storage and cooking facilities in the room, the children often, the parents struggle to find breakfast for their children. And what we have found in our reports and what we hear through our members and through our Access to Justice information line is that the parents are going to an SO station to try and find, a roll or something to give these children for breakfast. And often they make a choice between paying expensive transport charges to go to school, for the bus journey to school, and breakfast. The education of these children is severely disrupted. They have inadequate rest because of the conditions that they're sleeping in. The homeless accommodation can be noisy with discos or just other residents in emergency accommodation making noise. They're falling asleep at school. They're falling behind in their education. When they come back to the emergency accommodation in the evening, they have no place to do their homework. They have no place to have normal things that children do, like play dates, and to rest and relax. We're finding that their friendships are strained. Older children don't want to tell their friends. They're embarrassed to tell their friends where they're staying, and they experience anxiety, low self-esteem and feelings of isolation where these friendships break down. And so the cycle continues. We believe that the system needs to be redesigned in order to change this. And I'll hand over to my colleague Saoirse Brady, who will set out some of those solutions.
I suppose we all know that there is no constitutional right to housing in the Irish Constitution, but the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which Ireland has ratified, does afford children the right to an adequate standard of living, and that includes the provision of quality housing for those children. And while the Convention doesn't apply directly in Irish law, the Irish courts can exercise discretion in how much weight they give international law when making their decisions. In 2016, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child examined Ireland, and it expressed its concern at reports of families affected by homelessness facing significant delays in accessing social housing and frequently living in inappropriate temporary or an emergency accommodation on a long-term basis. The UN Committee called on the Irish State to undertake measures to increase the availability of social housing and emergency housing supports. I think we can all agree that the face of homelessness in Ireland has changed. When the existing legislation was put in place, it was there to support single adult males. Nowadays, lone parent families with children make up the biggest cohort in the homeless population. We don't think it's right that when local authorities decide where families with children will be accommodated, that they don't have to take the children's best interests into account. And this is why, as part of our No Child 2020 campaign, which is focused on child poverty and looks at the aims of the Democratic Programme of 1919, we are calling on the Government to put in place progressive legislation that would recognise the best interests of children and would mean that decision makers, when deciding where those children should be placed, should take their best interests into account and ensure that their needs are met. This would mean that they would have to consider things like, as Adele said, whether or not children would have to get up at 5:30 in the morning to make a 2.5-hour journey to school, whether or not children and babies, toddlers, would have the room to learn how to walk and crawl around, and whether teenagers would have enough privacy from their parents and siblings. Furthermore, the amended legislation should clearly time limit the use of emergency accommodation for children with families. Some families are locked into homelessness for years, as Mike said. He gave the figure of 167 families. That's 13% of families who are living in homeless accommodation that have been there for more than 2 years. And both the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and the Ombudsman for Children, who you'll hear from this morning, have called for time limits on how long a family should spend in temporary accommodation. And this is to avoid the risk of institutionalisation and the normalisation of homelessness. In July 2017, the Government, as we know, began to roll out family hubs after it didn't meet its own target to use emergency accommodation only in limited circumstances. And at the beginning of 2019, there were 26 hubs nationwide with a capacity to accommodate 600 families. And when we were doing a report card last year, and when we asked the Department of Housing, they had put in, up to the third quarter in 2018, they'd put €45 million into those family hubs. And while they are more suitable, they don't represent a long-term or child-appropriate solution. And children themselves, as I'm sure you'll hear from Dr Muldoon shortly, they don't see family hubs as a solution. So what is the long-term solution? I suppose if we want to realise the right of children to a home, we need to provide quality public housing. We would hope to see a move away from a reliance on the private rented sector and instead provide families with suitable, adequate and affordable accommodation where they feel secure and where children feel that they have a place that they can truly call home. Thank you.
I'd now like to call on Dr Niall Muldoon to make his opening statement from the Ombudsman for Children's Office.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the committee for the invitation to appear before you today. As members of the committee are aware, the Ombudsman for Children's Office is an independent statutory body which was established under the Ombudsman for Children Act 2002 as amended, and we have two core statutory functions. One is to promote the rights and welfare of children under 18 years of age, and second is to examine and investigate complaints made by or on behalf of children about the administrative actions of public bodies, schools or voluntary services that may or may have had an adverse effect on children. And since I came into office, the strategic priority of my office has included crisis and homelessness and family homelessness. The circumstances of children experiencing homelessness will remain a priority for my office as part of our new strategic plan for the period 2019 to 2021. And I'd like to take this opportunity today to highlight to the committee issues and recommendations contained in a report by my office called No Place Like Home. We published this report in April 2019, and its main purpose is to highlight the views and experiences of children living in family hubs. And as members of the committee know, the development of the family hubs emerged in 2017 and has been highlighted by Mike from Focus Ireland. It was done as an alternative to hotels and B&Bs as regards providing the emergency temporary accommodation needs of homeless families. And it was done proliferated in the absence of an evidence base and in any initial pilot phase, and there was no clear public policy objectives set out for their use. And as the Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government indicated here on 29th of May recently, there are 27 hubs in operation nationally, providing for 650 accommodation units. And in light of how the family hubs emerged, we believed that we wanted to learn more about what it was like for the children to live in those family hubs, and we've had a taste of it there from the Children's Rights Alliance. And this focus is not to distract or detract in any way from the very challenging circumstances faced by many other families who are providing emergency accommodations, hotels, B&Bs, those families who are self-accommodating or finding their own emergency accommodation, or families in the hidden homelessness sector. The consultation we undertook was between October 2018 and January 2019 and involved engaging directly with 37 children between the ages of 5 and 17 years of age and 33 parents who represented 43 children under 5 years of age living in family hubs at the time. We went to 8 family hubs, 5 in the Dublin area, 2 in Limerick and 1 in Cork, and they varied in terms of who operated them, whether it was NGO or private, by their location, their size and the facilities and support that were provided. This variation is reflected in the perspectives shared by the children, young people and parents who participated in our consultation and told us what they liked about living in family hubs, what they found challenging and what changes they'd like to see in those hubs. The positives that came from the younger children, they spoke about having and making friends in the family hubs. They spoke about the importance of outdoor play, space and equipment where that was available to them. And other children identified living in family hubs with child support workers about the positive activities and support they got from them. And it's important to note that several younger children could not identify anything positive about living in family hubs, with a number of them simply saying the word nothing. Children aged between 13 and 17 years of age identified positives as well, including the support provided by staff in the family hubs where they lived and the food that they got. Where they had facilities such as computers, TV rooms, study rooms, older children identified these as positive, and older children identified living in the family hub as comparatively better than what they had previously. For example, some of them would have been in crowded living accommodation with extended families in overcrowded housing, and this offered more stability than living in the hotel or B&B that they would have experienced as well. Parents of children under 5 years of age welcomed the relative security and stability provided by the hubs when compared with the more precarious living arrangements, including hotels. They also spoke about the support and helpfulness of staff working in the hubs and parents living with their children in family hubs that had good facilities, activities for their children and/or access to a child support worker highlighted these as positive features. Our report, No Place Like Home, also points to the real difficulties that living in family hubs presented for the children, notwithstanding the efforts and kindness of staff working in those hubs. In brief, the children accounted to highlight the negative impact that living in this tight environment is having on their family life, on parenting, on individual and family privacy, on children's ability to get adequate rest and sleep, children's health, well-being and development, children's ability to learn and study, children's opportunities for play and recreation, their exposure to aggression and fighting, their freedom of movement, their ability to maintain relationships with extended family and friends, and then compounding these challenges are the feeling of shame that were expressed by the children about being homeless and the feelings of failure that parents expressed about their situation. As regards changes that could improve family hubs, children and parents spoke about needing more and better space, the provision of more open communal areas for families to use, providing separate study space for children, providing space for families to meet with visitors, and providing outdoor play space in hubs that do not already have those. They also spoke about the need for better facilities, including cooking facilities, reducing rules and restrictions insofar as possible, and several older children spoke about the need to combat the stigma associated with family homelessness, while a number of parents expressed the view that regular reviews of family hubs should be undertaken. And the recommendation that was made most frequently was that families should have long-term, secure housing and receive all the support they need to access that. As one parent observed, if you change the small things, the bigger problems are still there. This is emergency accommodation, and it's the emergency that is the problem. Arising from the experiences and perspectives shared by children and parents, and having regard to international standards and developments, we within the report set out a number of priorities. Across policy and provision, we believe that timelines need to be put in place, as was mentioned earlier, but to end the practice of self-accommodation, providing emergency accommodation to families in hotels and B&Bs. We need an independent formal evaluation of the suitability of family hubs. We need additional measures to combat the stigma associated with family homelessness and to support the dignity, self-worth and resilience of our children and parents experiencing homelessness. Practical measures in that regard need to be considered seriously, including increasing the number of child support workers, therapeutic supports and family support services available to children and parents. We need to look at a national implementation of the National Quality Standards Framework for Homeless Services in Ireland, and we're delighted with the indication from the Minister of Housing recently that these will be introduced nationally over a 12-month period starting on the 1st of July of this year. In order to ensure appropriate monitoring, oversight and accountability, a mechanism for independent statutory inspection of homelessness services needs to be put in place, and we are concerned that these do not appear to be in the offing at any time in the near future. Data is a problem. Prompt progress needs to be made in that regards, developing and implementing improved practices for data collection and disaggregation, and this is vital to provide for an evidence-informed approach to legislation, public policy and provision in this area. Existing legislation needs to be amended and strengthened to make children visible and to require housing authorities to provide appropriate accommodation and supports to homeless families with children. And the issue of enumerating the right to housing in Constitution needs to be progressed as a matter of priority. And we would like the Oireachtas to proceed with a detailed examination of the recommendations contained in the report of the 8th Constitutional Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights from 2014. And I'm pleased to inform the committee that following a publication of No Place Like Home, I had a constructive meeting with the Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government in May, and I look forward to engaging further with him and his department about the proposed evaluation of family hubs. In light of the roles the Department of Children and Youth Affairs and TUSLA have under Rebuilding Ireland with regard to supporting families experiencing homelessness, I have also written to the Minister for Children and Youth Affairs to ask her to give serious consideration to increasing the practical supports, including child support workers and family support services that are available to children and parents living in emergency accommodation, including family hubs. And to conclude, my office fully appreciates that the crisis in family homelessness in Ireland is multifaceted and complex, and that family hubs are only one aspect of the current response to it. And I hope that our No Place Like Home report is a constructive contribution, and I can assure the committee that we will build on it over the coming years. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Muldoon. I'd now like to call on Ms. Rebecca Keating from the Mercy Law Resource Centre for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, committee members, for the invitation to present today. We warmly welcome this focus on child and family homelessness. Mercy Law is an independent law centre and registered charity, and our principal focus is provision of free legal advice and representation to individuals and families who are homeless or who are at risk of homelessness. Since 2015, Mercy Law has had an increasing number of vulnerable families accessing our service. In 2018 overall, Mercy Law advised over 720 individuals and families, of which 244 were families experiencing homelessness. Currently, 57% of our clients are families with minor children who are homeless. 77% of our clients are of ethnic minority. Building on our substantive submission and other Mercy Law reports that you have before you, I wish to highlight 6 key concerns and related recommendations this morning. Firstly, since 2015, Mercy Law has frequently engaged with families refused emergency accommodation, with their only options to then sleep in parks, in cars, in uninhabitable caravans, chronically overcrowded or unsafe conditions, or in Garda stations. Mercy Law sees firsthand the devastating impact on families and their children of improper refusals of emergency accommodation. There is currently no strict legal obligation on housing authorities to provide emergency accommodation. There is a discretion, but no duty. Recent High Court decisions have afforded broad discretion to housing authorities with respect of the homeless assessment. It is our position that the wide margin of discretion afforded to housing authorities within the current legal framework does not adequately protect for homeless families with minor children. Mercy Law continues to call for protection of the right to housing in the Constitution. Specifically, as part of a shift to a legal rights-based approach, we recommend a tightening of the statutory provisions contained in the Housing Act 1988 to eliminate the statutory discretion and to impose a duty on the housing authority to provide such emergency accommodation. Secondly, we raise a most urgent concern with respect to provision of one-night-only emergency accommodation. Mercy Law frequently assists families who are placed on one-night-only emergency accommodation. These include families with very young children, with children with special needs. It includes new mothers and their newborn babies discharged from maternity hospitals. It includes victims of domestic violence. Mercy Law experiences firsthand on numerous occasions the deep distress and chaos of families placed in chronically unstable emergency accommodation. Families must move every day. They frequently cannot access their accommodation until 8 p.m. in the evening and must leave by 9:30 in the morning. Families have no secure place to go during the day and spend prolonged periods in shopping centres, in parks, on the streets or on buses. Families have no access to cooking or laundry facilities. They ordinarily cannot register their children for school or access primary health care without any fixed address or any stable accommodation. Mercy Law understands that as of the 1st of June 2019, 80 families were on one-night-only provision, an increase on the figure we understood to be 50 families as of December of last year. Without success, Mercy Law has sought the legal basis and reasons why some families are placed on this provision, whereas others are put in more stable, rolling bookings of accommodation. It affects families who are on the housing list and families who are not on the housing list alike. And in our experience, it affects ethnic minority families disproportionately. A family on this provision cannot meet its basic needs, let alone resolve its long-term housing issues. It compounds the chaos and distress of homelessness. It is simply a provision that is not fit for purpose. Mercy Law believes that such provision may expose families and their children to inhuman and degrading treatment of such severity to engage Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and it is also observed that there may be discriminatory practice such that ethnic minorities are disproportionately affected. Our strong and unqualified recommendation to the committee is for cessation of provision of one-night-only emergency accommodation to homeless families and provision of stable placement in suitable temporary accommodation for such families. We also call for transparency in relation to why families are placed on such chronically unstable provision and an equality review by the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive and housing authorities to identify and address any potentially discriminatory practices. Thirdly, we concur with fellow members here with respect of the self-accommodation provision, which we see as failing the most vulnerable families. But this provision is made to families across the board with little or no regard to their individual needs or their vulnerabilities. Vulnerable families, including in particular ethnic minority, non-Irish national and larger families, face insurmountable barriers to accessing self-accommodation. They do not have the language skills or resources to identify potential hotel or B&B bookings, and/or family size means hotel and B&Bs are simply not a feasible option for them. Bookings, if achieved, are insecure and unstable. Families must frequently move, interfering with access to education, to healthcare and social and family stability. Mercy Law agrees with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission that families should not have to source their own emergency accommodation. And we support the call by Dr Muldoon from the Ombudsman for Children for an end to self-accommodation. We also recommend the issuing of regulations by the Minister to specify and restrict the type of emergency accommodation provision that families may be accommodated in, therefore ensuring its suitability and its adequacy. Fourthly, we note that Rebuilding Ireland stated that by the middle of 2017, hotels would be used for emergency accommodation in very limited circumstances. Yet, as of February 2019, over half of homeless families in Dublin remain in commercial hotels. We regularly engage with families who are in inappropriate emergency accommodation for excessive periods. Very recently, we engaged with a family who'd been in a hotel for 28 months. Last week, we had a call from a family who had been in hotel accommodation for 3.5 years. That hotel and B&B accommodation, even for short periods, is unacceptable and inflicts damage on families is widely accepted and established. So we need to see the end of reliance on commercial hotels and B&Bs as a form of emergency accommodation for families. We continue to call, as has been called for today, on a limit on the time that families spend in unsuitable emergency accommodation, such as commercial hotels. With respect of hubs, we share concerns with respect of hubs presenting a risk of institutionalisation and normalising of family homelessness. We would like to add from our casework experience specific concerns in relation to family hubs, in addition to these already articulated concerns. There is a clear lack of transparency in relation to access to family hubs and transitional accommodation. Mercy Law has been informed by 2 housing authorities that there is no published criteria or process for accessing a family hub. In the words of one housing officer, identification of a family for placement in a hub will depend on that family being in the mind of the housing officer. Our clients are rarely in a position to put themselves in the mind of a housing officer. We would question the equality of access to family hubs. A relatively low number of spaces, as we've seen, the vast majority of families, well over half, are in commercial hotels, so there are substantial delays in any placement in such family hubs, and hubs are generally not configured to accommodate larger families. We note also with concern, and these concerns are reflected in the report from the Ombudsman for Children, with respect to the variation in standards in family hubs. And we would have particular concerns in respect of several former commercial hotels that have been effectively rebranded as family hubs. We call for a shift away from family hubs to provision of homeless accommodation in transitional accommodation, owned or transitional accommodation. And we recommend the publishing of accessibility criteria and procedures for accessing family hubs and transitional accommodation placements. And we share the call for creation of an independent inspections body to conduct regular inspections of homeless services. Finally, Mercy Law welcomed the recognition in Rebuilding Ireland that families with children presenting as homeless require a separate and distinct response. Yet a common theme in our concerns as presented today is the failure of housing authorities to recognise and meet the particular needs and vulnerabilities of homeless families. Mercy Law has previously received assurances from the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive that mechanisms are in place to identify and provide supports to vulnerable families. Yet it is our experience that these mechanisms are failing vulnerable families. To remedy this, we support the proposed amendment to the Housing Act to place a statutory obligation on housing authorities to regard the best interests of children as paramount, to have regard to the needs of the family unit and to make provision of suitable accommodation to that family unit to ensure its effective functioning. Mercy Law, in conclusion, believes in the inherent dignity of each human person and sees such dignity frequently violated in the deep trauma and distress of homeless families. This crisis calls for urgent and progressive measures to meaningfully address such trauma, to restore dignity to those impacted by this housing crisis, and to minimise the harm currently being inflicted on homeless families. Many thanks, and we look forward to engaging with the committee.
Thank you, Ms Keating. Owen?
Thanks to everybody for the presentations. Just firstly, I want to acknowledge the work that all of your organisations are doing to highlight the issues that you've raised today, and in particular the reports that you've been publishing. It's important not to underestimate their value. I know sometimes you spend a lot of time researching and publishing and launching, and then you wonder what happens. Those reports are a vital resource, particularly to a committee like this, to fully understand the issues that you're raising, and particularly those reports that give voice and platform to the experiences of children are particularly valuable. So I just want you to know that that work is in no way wasted whatsoever. I also just want to place on the record that in addition to the 4 organisations that are here today, we've had 2 very significant pieces of research published this week. The Equality and Human Rights Commission have published a report themselves, and one of the aspects of that report looks at accommodation and homelessness. And probably one of the most stinging sentences in the report is where the Commission, and I quote here, believes that the rise in homelessness has been significantly exacerbated by government policy choices in this regard. On the same day, a very important academic paper was published in the Geographical Journal by 3 academics looking at the experience and the negative physical and emotional impact on hotel accommodation on children. And again, I think it would be worthwhile if the Committee Secretariat could circulate those to other members, because they make for very stark reading. It's also important to acknowledge that the range of voices that are now raising these concerns aren't just the traditional NGO sector, and it's not that I'm in any way disparaging the NGO sector, having worked for it, but it's important that members understand that when the NGO sector is now being joined by statutory organisations like the Office of the Ombudsman for Children and the Human Rights and Equality Alliance, or Human Rights and Equality Commission, excuse me, that's a very significant thing. They're government agencies funded by government, and they have a very different role in this debate. And then when you hear very strong independent academic research that also kind of emphasises that the depth of this problem is far greater than I think many people out there fully appreciate. The Department publishes a range of reports, monthly reports on homeless numbers and quarterly reports on performance and financial indicators. And Eoin O'Sullivan, who committee members know well from Trinity College, who's been in here, he produces a kind of an explanatory guide to that, because those reports are quite difficult for us to digest. And he circulated the most recent excuse me, summary recently. And what he has concluded from the government's own information is, in the last quarter and year, entries into homelessness are up, repeat entries into homelessness are up, exits from homelessness are down, the length of stay families and individuals are spending in emergency accommodation is up. Over 80% of the homeless budget is going on emergency responses and less than 5% on prevention. So again, it's not just the statutory sector, the NGO sector, the academic sector, even the government's own figures as presented by Dr Sullivan show that we have a huge problem. And one of the things, Chair, I'd like the committee to consider is not just to take the submissions today. I do think, given the strength of what we're hearing, we need to seriously consider doing a report to the Minister outlining the kinds of policy changes we think the Minister needs to consider, including, some or many of the options that are put here on the table. So the good people here aren't just making a presentation to us, but we're then kind of considering which ones of those recommendations we support or we want to prioritise, and then we forward that to the Minister. I have questions, and just 4, I suppose, straightforward questions for all of the presenters. There's a lot of recommendations there, and clearly, of course, many of us would like to see all of them implemented, but we also live in the real world. And if, as a committee, we were to do a report and we were to try and identify some priority recommendations for each of your organisations or alliances, what would be the 1 or 2 really significant ones we'd like you to make? We can stretch it to 3 maybe, but really the point is the more focused we are on what we're calling on government to do, I think it would be important to hear that. Obviously, if the Minister or the Department were here, they would be reminding us about the increase in social housing output. And there is an increase in social housing output, and we have to acknowledge it, although many of us are very critical that it is nowhere near enough. So I suppose what I'd like to hear from each of your organisations or alliances is, what is your view on the current and proposed output of real social housing owned by approved housing bodies and local authorities? Do you think it is enough to meet the demand that you know is there? And if not, what do you think should be the output? Because really the debate isn't whether houses are being produced or not, it's whether the amount being produced is enough, and I'd like to hear your views. One of the things that does concern me greatly is while the quality standards framework that has been produced by the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive is very good, I've met them, I've seen it, and I do welcome the fact that, if I understood the Minister correctly when he presented to committee here recently, those standards will now apply to both voluntary sector and private sector emergency accommodation, which wasn't originally the case. The inspections won't be independent, and it's not that I'm questioning the people in the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive or local authorities, but if you are funding that emergency accommodation, there is clearly a conflict of interest if you're then also inspecting it for the standards. So again, I'd like to know each of your organisations' views on the importance of those independent inspections and if you think where they should be located. And then my final question relates to the right to housing. We obviously had an Oireachtas debate on this matter, and not everybody in this committee is on the same page. There are members of the Oireachtas who are saying they're open to the idea, but they are yet to be convinced. So what I'd like each of your organisations to do, because I know you've all advocated this, in as plain a set of arguments as you can make, what do you believe would be the difference of having a constitutional right to housing? I'm already convinced, but I'm asking you to kind of direct that question to members of the committee who I think are genuinely open to considering it but have yet to be convinced of it. What would you say to members of this committee who have yet to fully appreciate the value of that? What difference would it or could it make? And why do you think it's something that the government should support? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Take them in reverse order, and then ask Niamh to maybe comment on the specific things that we would like to see, which was the first question. On the constitutional right, I suppose the particular contribution we would make to that is the number of times I've heard ministers say that things which they would otherwise wish to do cannot be done because the Attorney-General has said that it would be against the Constitution, proves to me that the Constitution, as interpreted, prevents a genuine barrier to some of the solutions that ministers, while in office, claim that they would wish to otherwise take, and that goes right back. So there are very positive reasons for changing the Constitution, but the one I would give for the committee to consider is repeated ministers saying the Constitution, the current balance between the public good and the right to property is being interpreted in such a way that the individual right to property is trumping, if we can use that word, the desire of committees, the Dáil and ministers to make changes in areas like tenancy rights, property, taking property which isn't being developed, and so on. And if the Constitution is presenting that sort of barrier against the people's will, the Constitution is meant to represent our will and we should change it. there are positive reasons, I'm sure others will give it. On independent inspection, we haven't actually, Folkestone hasn't got a formal position on who we think should be done. We do agree it should be independent. We are, as an organisation, reluctant to see building of more long-term institutions which are assuming that homelessness is always going to be with us, so that we believe that the inspection should probably be attached to an existing institution which is able to do that. HICWA is the obvious one, but it would require some significant changes in what HICWA does, because we aren't medicinal clinical facilities and so on, and we don't want clinical standards. We want high standards, but not clinical standards set for independent accommodation, but that would be one way to go. On the question of the output, quite clearly, as Deputy O'Brien has identified, the number of exits to homelessness is going down, the number of people becoming homeless is going up. Quite clearly there isn't enough, the supply of social and affordable housing is totally inadequate. We believe that while it is arguable whether the targets are being met as intended in the plan, the targets aren't high enough for the scale of the problem we had. What has bedevilled the entire response to homelessness since the very beginning of this crisis in whenever, about 2014, is a consistent underestimation of the scale of it by successive governments, and therefore the scale of the housing that's required. The single player that is refusing to come on the pitch, that is absolutely essential to this, is the local authorities. And this is not an ideological position. Families don't care whether their house was built by the private sector or an approved housing body or a local authority. They do care about the quality of it and the tenure they have and the rent they will pay. But one of historically, the player that delivered a quarter of the housing that people in Ireland currently live in was local authorities. If they refuse or fail to play a role, which is what's currently happening in delivery of housing generally during the current era, we're going to suffer from that, and they've got to be there, and they're not, and that needs to be changed. On what we would single demand, there's always that question. I would say, if there's one thing, we need a strategy. I know it doesn't answer, but so one particular response isn't going to solve the issue. So I'll ask Niamh to say a couple of things about specific things, but unless there is some sort of plan in deals with this, of this is what we understand the problem to be, these are the sorts of things we're going to do to resolve it, and we expect them to do these solutions, any individual thing that you throw into that is just going to get lost in the mix. So maybe if you'd...
Just in terms of the specifics, so that the Family Homeless Action Team in Focus Ireland would work with over probably the majority of homeless families in Dublin. Like last month alone, we worked with 1,074 children in homelessness. So every one of those is a child that's struggling, that's in trauma, in accommodation. I'm struck also at what Adele mentioned as well about, like, many of these children are under 5 years of age. Some of them are born into homelessness. This is what we're seeing week in, week out with our child support workers on our team. I welcome the Ombudsman's Office report and recommendations for more child support workers in hubs. Hubs are not the ideal, but while children are in hubs, we need to have a better support mechanism in place for them. So if we had child support workers allocated to families, on my team at the moment we have 9% of the children linked to our services. We're in 24 locations all over Dublin, and we only have 9% of those children with child support workers. So I would suggest an increase in those supports. In terms of the standards of accommodation, so the hubs are not the ideal, but while they're in hubs, we're all agreeing to improve that. But for the move-on options for families, last year alone, the Family HAP team moved on most families to HAP accommodation. This year, it's the same. So the majority is HAP. We're all too aware that the private rented sector is not the ideal move-on option for families. There is a good possibility that many families are returning back into homelessness from HAP accommodation. So it's around having better, more long-term, sustainable accommodation for families with an increase in social and affordable housing. In terms of the self-accom families, which was mentioned by Rebecca in Mercy Law, I would echo those thoughts as well around an end to self-accommodating families. These families are the most traumatised. If there's layers of trauma in homeless families, these families are families who are night by night are not sure where they're going to be staying the next night. They're packing up their belongings. They're telling their children they're not sure whether they'll be able to bring them to school in the morning time. They're telling their children they're not sure where they'll be staying the next night. They're walking the streets by daytime, nowhere to go. So most certainly self-accommodating, like to hear that there's 80 families self-accommodating is quite a stark figure, and I think we should never forget that there's so many children and parents behind these figures that we're talking about today. I think that was most of the points just wanted to pick up on. I agree, obviously, with our folks are in stance around the independent inspections as well, and that HICWA may be the best place to look at that. That's all from me for now.
Edel, do you want to come in now? Or?
We'll share the 4 questions. In terms of priorities, our No Child 2020 campaign kind of does that. We have kind of short-term recommendations and long-term wins. The short-term one is around the amendment to the legislation, so ensuring that the best interests of the child is as part of the legislation, the Housing Act, and then the time limit on the length of stays in emergency accommodation. And then the longer-term piece is around redirecting the investment away from the short-term solutions to the longer-term public housing. And then the other one was around the right to housing. What would that mean? I mean, for children, it would mean that they have enforceable rights. They can go before the courts where their rights are being denied, and try and have those rights enforced. So really, it would be, it could potentially be a game changer for children who are finding themselves in these situations.
And then in terms of the output, I think Mike's covered that quite well, and we'd agree with all of that. But the other point I'd make is the programme for government itself. One of the commitments it made was to provide rapid build houses, and this is something we look at in report card every year. But when we've asked the Department of Housing about this, they have actually switched tack, and they've told us that now the focus is putting that investment into family hubs. So since the rapid build programme was brought in 2016, only 350 houses have been built under that programme, so it's not actually delivering. So yes, the answer is that local authorities need to build more housing and need to invest in that. And then in terms of quality standards, I think we've been quite clear about our position on this. It would be HICWA. We would advocate for HICWA to take on independent inspections of both direct provision accommodation as well as emergency homelessness accommodation. And HICWA does have a good track record in this. They already inspect places where children live, like Oberstown Detention School, like children's residential units where children are in care. So they have those standards there. Recently, when we were working with the Department of Justice to produce the national standards for direct provision accommodation, we drew very heavily on HICWA standards. And HICWA would be the most cost-effective option because you wouldn't have to put a whole new framework in place. They already have public confidence, so we would strongly advocate for HICWA taking this over. We've spoken to HICWA about it. It would mean an expansion of their team. It would mean amendments to the Health Act, but I think an amendment to the Health Act would probably be more, time effective as well. It's not that big a change. We've already drafted it for some things, and I know you have as well, Deputy O'Brien. So yeah, that's where we would stand on that.
Dr. Muldoon.
I'll share with my colleague, Dr. Macaulay. In relation to the priorities, I suppose we think we can really quickly get child support workers into every family hub. I think we can provide a huge support there. We've also mentioned the possibility of therapeutic support in that situation, because we are talking here about adverse childhood experience. These children will be coming back to us in 10, 15 years' time, saying they've been traumatised by the state's inability to find them a home. If we can intervene now at this stage and provide them with some sort of therapeutic support, I think that, and the older family members, the parents as well, that could be a very quick intervention for maybe 3-4 years, depending on what the government feel they will move them out at. We also look at whether it's medium-term or short-term primary legislation changes. They've been highlighted by the Mercy Law and by all of my colleagues here. I think they're really getting the voice of the child into the legislation so that they have to be adhered to by the local authorities. Our children are not part of what they need to follow, and if, as somebody has been said many times before, legislation creates behaviour. That's what they need to follow. If the legislation doesn't mention children, then the children will not be of interest to the local authorities, and people have to make decisions in this regard. So we need to change that as quickly as possible, whether that's short or medium term, that's up to the legislators. And then obviously from our point of view, the long-term change is the constitutional change, so that we acknowledge as a society that we're putting a floor below which we will not allow any child to fall. And we're talking about our children. We're talking about 4,000 children, the guts of 4,000 children at this moment in time. 3 years ago, there was only 2,000. We are not getting away from it. And if we're talking, as Mike says, it'll be 2023, That's a huge number of children who need to know that they're going to get a safe, dignified and peaceful place to spend their childhood. Because everything from there on, this is the hierarchy of needs. If you do not have shelter, you cannot provide for yourself and reach your potential in any other area, whether that's education, health, relationships, all those are affected. So the constitutional amendment, and I would be with Mike's idea that we need to challenge it in some way or other, whether that's through a referendum, whether it's through courts. We need to find out what are the real parameters and what does society want. My understanding would be that if you put the right options to the people, that they would see the benefit of creating a constitutional right to housing. The Special Rapporteur on Housing, UN Special Rapporteur on Housing, said that homelessness is an assault on human dignity, and that's what we need to accept. We need to accept that that's happening continuously on our watch, and we need to change that, and the constitutional change would be the long-term intervention there. The output on housing is not something that we would have a huge expertise on, but I suppose the one thing I listen to everything that comes out in regards to that, and we're seeing a lot of cheerleading as regards co-location or co-living, student accommodation, different types of rental accommodation. I don't hear an awful lot about family accommodation. I don't hear an awful lot about where children are going to be actually growing up. We hear where we're moving independent, well-financed young people to, different options like that. There's 1/3 of our rental accommodations now rent to buy, or buy to rent. Again, if they're the right size and the right space for our families to grow up in and over the next 25, 30 years, that's fine. But I don't hear that being part of the core discussion. It's about bodies, it's not about our children and our families and the growth that they deserve into the future. So when we're talking about output of housing, for me, it would be about making sure that the families of our future generations, of these children, have somewhere that they can grow, thrive and survive, which is what their UN Convention on the Rights of the Child offers them. The constitutional right I've spoken about. I'll just let Karen talk about the framework and the national qualifications.
Yeah, in terms of the independent inspection piece, and as we highlighted in the report, I think the key thing for us is that there is statutory independent inspection. And one can look at different mechanisms. I mean, as others have highlighted, we're not looking either for suggesting that a new body should be established. You know, there are risks associated with that, not only around cost, but about institutionalising further our thinking around all of this. So I suppose, as others have said, as the Ombudsman for Children has said, HICWA may be an obvious candidate for it in terms of its standing, its experience. As has been said previously, they've extensive experience of inspecting different types of accommodation which are there for different purposes for children, and of engaging with children actually in the context of conducting those independent statutory inspections. So from our point of view, HICWA might be, I suppose, a clear, obvious candidate for that area of work. But the point is, our concern really is there doesn't seem to be any plan right now to move towards a model of independent statutory inspection and ensuring with that the necessary oversight and accountability.
Dr. McCauley, Ms. Keating.
Thank you, and thank you for those questions. Just with respect to the right to housing, I mean, you'll be well familiar, we published a trilogy of reports with respect to the right to housing and have consistently advocated for constitutional protection on the right to housing. And I would concur with the points made by colleagues here with respect of why it would make a meaningful difference in this time of housing crisis. I suppose we would be looking at it from a future-proofing approach as well, that we're trying to safeguard against recurrence of this crisis in the future, and we believe such an amendment would provide a long-standing floor protection for homeless individuals, for families facing housing difficulty, and influence on a much broader scale policy making and law making with respect to housing. And I would certainly agree as well the comments made about policy measures and legislation brought forward which have essentially been blocked on the basis that there is this constitutional barrier. So what we see the need for is a rebalancing of the constitutional provisions that prevents this being a repeated block on measures coming in to meaningfully address the very serious crisis that we face. Because we've heard a lot today about rebuilding Ireland, and those commitments were made in 2017, and yet we are here 2 years later with the same issues and the same statistics going up. And we need to look at bigger picture measures to really meaningfully address the crisis that we have. But I have to acknowledge, of course, that the Constitutional Amendment is no silver bullet. It has to be coupled by political will. It has to be coupled with meaningful resources to properly change policy. And just our second report, which may be of interest, it was a comparative analysis looking at other jurisdictions, and that report established that protection of such a right is common in well-functioning democracies. And yes, everybody has a different model. There's no one-size-fits-all, but it does exist elsewhere, and it has had a meaningful impact. I'm just going backwards. I'm taking Mike's approach as well. Just with respect to standards, I just make a comment about the national standards framework as it is, and it is welcome, but our experience is certainly that there's a very low awareness among homeless individuals and families of these standards, and including the complaints mechanism. So we would frequently engage with families who are having issues with their emergency accommodation that perhaps are not yet legal issues, and they would have they would not have their hands on the very substantive document that is the standards, and they may not be engaged with key workers, because the reality is that key workers are generally allocated to those in the most stable forms of emergency accommodation. And so at the early stages, those families on one-night onlys, those families in self-accommodation, don't necessarily have a key worker who can direct them to the standards and the complaints mechanism. And we would agree that a statutory independent inspection regime is what is needed, and we wouldn't have a formal position with respect of the appropriate body to undertake that. The second question was with respect of, is the output of real social housing, is it enough? Well, the answer to that has to be categorically that it is completely inadequate, and that is why the statistics continue to increase, and that is why we are all here today discussing this issue of child and family homelessness. We would see that HAP is the default option presented by housing authorities to our clients, and we see that it is part of the social housing framework, and the legislation has been amended to make it the new form of social housing support. It is clearly unsuitable for a large number of families. It is also inaccessible to a large number of families. We would deal with a number of families who are ethnic minority, with large family size, and they are unable to source tenancies in the private rented market, and yet there is an expectation by the housing authorities that they are not trying hard enough, that they are not looking hard enough, despite clear evidence to the contrary. So HAP is not the solution to this crisis. The solution is to build more housing, to build more public and social housing. And just a comment with respect to approved housing bodies, I mean, we would have a number of clients who move into approved housing bodies, and the standard is excellent, and that is where a vast majority, it seems, of social housing is coming. It is important to note that the security of tenure in an approved housing body is less secure than it would be in a social housing dwelling. And that should just be noted, because the approved housing bodies are under the residential tenancies legislation. And we would work with clients who have been transferred to approved housing bodies from social housing, who have their tenancies terminated lawfully in the first 6 months. So they may have been secure for 25 years or 40 years, as was the case in one instance, and then in the first week of the new tenancy, as it were, under new legislation, that was terminated. So that is a deficiency in the legislation, and it's quite a niche area, but it can cause huge suffering, and that would be a concern arising from our casework. And just finally, your first question was, what are the priority recommendations? And you said 2 or 3, and I'm going to come up with 3. We would really urgently call for a look at Section 10 to shift from a discretionary power to provide emergency accommodation to a duty, because that causes huge confusion, obfuscation and improper refusals of emergency accommodation in our mind. Secondly, we would call for the cessation of one-night onlys. And I just would like to make a distinction between the self-accommodation and one-night onlys, because self-accommodation is when the family can book themselves the hotel. If you're on a one-night only, you're not permitted to do that. You're placed that night. And sometimes self-accommodation families can't find a booking, so they revert to this one-night only system. So those families are really the most vulnerable. They are in the most precarious circumstances, and they really are in the most distressing and chaotic circumstances that they are not in a position to articulate and put out there, because they are too busy packing their bags, getting on the bus, trying to figure out how they're going to feed the children, get the children to the doctor. And so we would really like to see some attention on that issue. And thirdly, regulations to put a time limit on the periods families can spend in inappropriate accommodation, and an obligation on housing authorities to assess the suitability of emergency accommodation. So we stop putting families in hotels, that there is a statutory obligation on housing authorities to assess, is hotel accommodation appropriate for this family? That does not happen at the moment. There is a blanket use of hotel accommodation. We see very little assessment of the actual needs, and we feel that regulations in that regard would go some way to place an obligation and to bring that vulnerability assessment into the legal framework.
Thank you, Ms Keating. Normally in the first round we go well over in time, but it actually airs a lot of questions for members. So, Deputy Casey.
Thank you, Chair, and thank everybody for their presentations here this morning. And I suppose this is the one issue that has been coming back to haunt us over my 3-year term in here, is the complete failure to get to grips with the child homeless problem in this country. And I suppose just in my 3 years here, we've seen a 90% increase in family homelessness, and we've seen a 102% increase in child homelessness. And I have to put on record here, and I have put on record before, I've witnessed child homelessness in my own hotel. So I've seen the family arriving late at night with the family. I've seen them getting up exceptionally early the following morning. And my hotel is located in a very remote part of Wicklow, and they were asked to go back to Dublin City to school, to get the phone call later on that day that the same family was coming back again that night after packing their bags up. So I have witnessed that horrendous experience that those families are going through. And it's the greatest scar on the country at the moment, is child homelessness and the effect that it's having on them. I don't want to get too much, Micah, maybe go to yourself first for a while, too much into the figures, because you said we have to move beyond the figures. But what does concern me, in your own report that you gave us, you said in April you've seen 94 families and 137 children present as homeless in the month of April, whereas the department's figures are saying there's a decrease of 13 families and 37 children. So if both figures are accurate, you're looking at substantial new presentations to child and family homelessness just in that month of April. And again, it goes to show that we're just not getting anywhere close to getting on top of the crisis that's out there. And we all know the long-term solution is simply just build more houses, but we don't seem to be able to get there at the moment. And Mike, I think you mentioned the fiscal thing yesterday, and you mentioned 2023 and 48,000. You see that as is that the magic figure that we need to get to see child and family homelessness being preventing, or do we need to go beyond that? And what happens with the historical stuff that we're failing to reach the targets we've set ourselves now in relation to delivering social housing? So is there a historical build-up, or does the 48,000 deal with the historical build-up as well? Just maybe on a few other issues, and we did mention, I think Edel mentioned the impact on schools, and we did have a debate, I don't know whether it was at this committee recently, that do you see a difference in the ability of schools who are DESH status being able to deal with the problems better than schools who don't have DESH status? And I suppose the reason I'm asking that, schools with DESH status probably have more funding to deal with child homelessness education and put measures around them that can help them deal with the crisis. I have said I've witnessed it, and I can only heart go out to people who have to find accommodation on a night-to-night basis. I just can't understand the simple logic of a woman who's pregnant, and we know that their child is due, and yet they're in a night-on-a-night basis. I just can't fathom how that can happen in today's society. Why we can't, regardless if it's a hotel room or a hub or whatever it may be, that woman doesn't know where she's going to be going that night. I find that horrendous and completely unacceptable, regardless of what type of accommodation that they're going into, that they don't know that they're going into accommodation. You did mention that the refusals of emergency accommodation, and maybe if you could expand on that, a little bit more to get a better understanding of the type of cohort of people that we're talking about that are being refused emergency accommodation. And Mike, maybe you might comment on own front doors thing. Owen would have raised this a number ago. Maybe if you could explain to people what own front door actually means, and you know, you're anxious that that figure is identified as a figure moving forward, and maybe you could explain to us exactly what your own front door means. There's no immediate solution. We all are aware of that, and I think everybody in the room here wants to see this crisis resolved. So, in the absence of social housing, or the number of housing being delivered, we are going to look at the solutions that are before us at the moment. There's no other solution out there that I know of, or is there? Is there something that we're missing that is better than what's being offered at the moment that we can, you know, actually do? Because we've all mentioned constitutional right and no one's right. Some of us are open. I'm actually open to any solution. I don't care really what way it comes. I do believe political will override most things if the will is there to do these things, to take the risk and make the tough decisions and implement the legislation that's required. I don't think we need a constitutional right, but if in the absence of political will, well then children and mothers need that constitutional right. But at the end of the day, I just think it needs political will more so than anything to resolve this crisis. I think I've ended up making more statements than questions, but I think Owen has asked most of the questions, like what can we do in the next 6 months to try and address this problem? Because we all know the long-term solution, but how can we improve hubs? How can we improve hotels? What is out there that is different, do you know what I mean, that we could do tomorrow morning to improve the quality of life of these almost now 4,000 children and 1,700 families? Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Pat. Pat, if it's okay, I'm going to take Fergus as well now, because by the time we go through, judging the time we have left, it might be more efficient. Is that all right with you, Fergus?
Yeah, thank you, Chairperson. I'd like to welcome our guests here today, and I must say I agree with everything that you said. There's nothing that you've written or said that I disagree with. And I just want to take up the last point that Deputy made there. There's a lot more we can do, and I think one of the things that struck me during the election recently was the continuing the number of empty houses I've come across. Now, there are many reasons why they're empty. Some of them have trees growing out of the front door almost. Some of them are derelict. A significant number of them are, I believe, occupiable. In other words, it may be, I don't know what reason they're empty, but I do know that it wouldn't take a lot of money to put them right because they're in newer estates. And I think what we need to do here is we need to, and I'm not criticising anybody, but I'm just saying local authorities need to have, I know they're supposed to have officers in charge of sourcing empty homes. And I go back to the example in Louth, where we put, I think, something like 100 homes which were empty, many of them derelict and abandoned, put them back into occupation for a figure less than €100,000, including all legal fees and everything else. So I think we need to drive with renewed energy that agenda, and I think it has to be driven where the homeless problems are worse, which are obviously in the bigger towns and cities. Now, there is an issue. Some homes are empty because the person who owns them may be in a nursing home, and I respect absolutely the right to integrity of person of their property, and I absolutely respect that. But I don't see why a local authority can't, with the HSE or whoever, make appropriate and respectful communication with those people or their families, and to see is there a way we could get them into short-term occupation if needs be. But I think there's a lot more we should be doing, and it's a shame. Like I know at least 40 homes in Drogheda that should be occupied tonight that aren't, and they're not because there's nobody pushing the agenda locally that I can see to do that. The second point is that, and again it's going back to centre of towns and central populations over the shop. If you look at Drogheda, 40, 50 years ago, there were 300 or 400 people living in the centre of a town. Now there's nobody there. Now the problem is the accommodation has got old. It doesn't necessarily meet standards. But I do believe there is a grant scheme where, again, we should have an officer going around from the council. What have you got over your shop? Can we use it? It may be suitable to single people. It may be suitable to childless couples. I know in many cases it isn't suitable to children. I understand that. But I just feel there's a lack of urgency on the ground. Right? The political system, I think, wants it to happen. The money is there, but it's not happening fast enough. That's my opinion. But I think that as regards the right to a home, I think that should be in the Constitution. Absolutely, it should be. It's an absolute essential right. I'm lucky to be a parent and a grandparent, and I would hate to think that my grandchildren, as they are now, would be homeless, or anybody would be homeless, or would be living in the type of accommodation they have to live in. And I was a teacher for many years, and I worked with children who had a lot of disadvantages in terms of educational disadvantage and social and economic issues. But, like, you know, if they're not coming from their own home, if they haven't got a door to, you know, a room to go into, you know, and they're all stuck together like you know, a family, they have no quality of life. And the crime, to me, what is happening, I believe, and what is really wrong, is that I have children who are now coming into me in my office, like with their parents, who are almost 10 years of age before they get a home of their own. I mean, that's a decade lost to a family, and I think that is unacceptable. And I just feel that, and without apportioning blame or anything like that, I think there's a lot more we could and must do with our local authority, with our political system, and it just needs that extra energy. And I would hope that your contribution today will be an agent for that change. And don't step back from what you're saying. You know, and I mean, it really is hugely important, because your words do count, and they are impacting on people. And it is a shame in Ireland today, you know, that this is happening. We know the economic reason it happened. We know the collapse of the economy. But things have changed, but they're not changing fast enough. So I just want to laud our speakers and fully support their views. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thanks, Fergus. I'll start with Ms. Keating.
Thank you, Deputy Casey, for your your first-hand experience of families who are accessing hotel accommodation. Just with respect of the impact on schools, and I'm sure Child Rights Alliance will speak to that. I mean, I note that in Rebuilding Ireland, homeschool liaison officers was one of the extra supports due to be implemented, and we would have come across certainly homeschool liaison officers in DEIS schools and outside of DEIS schools. But certainly, having seen the coverage of the presentation of Focus Ireland yesterday, that 91% of Focus Ireland families accessing Focus Ireland services do not have a child support worker is of serious concern. And we would have concerns that the most vulnerable families, the supports that are there are just simply not accessible, and they're not made available at the earliest opportunity. And one example I'll give is of a family who were on a self-accommodation and really struggled to get a booking. They then got a booking after 6 months of very precarious living in a hotel out near the airport, and then had a 90-kilometre round trip to the children's school. During the course of the year, the children, 2 primary school children, missed 80% of their schooling. And with the school was very supportive, but I mean, how can the school actually address that? Because that takes a really interagency approach, and that takes a holistic approach. And I had difficulty even linking that family to primary health care in the area because of their precarious and unstable accommodation. Their booking wasn't simply for long enough. So it is not straightforward. It is complex, but it is the wraparound supports that have been articulated, certainly in Rebuilding Ireland, but haven't materialised for all families. Just with respect to the one-night onlys, and your words horrendous and completely unacceptable, they're very welcome, because those situations that we encounter, and we encounter them too frequently, certainly they are horrendous, and there seems to be no logic to it. And I would have dealt with a number of mothers, new mothers who have been discharged from maternity hospitals into one night only. And one mother before Christmas who was discharged with a baby who was born 4 weeks premature and a 16-month-old baby onto one night onlys. And she was in shopping centres trying to prepare bottles, unable to sterilise bottles, unable to breastfeed her child, unable to be somewhere safe and secure during the winter months. Now, we engaged and we were able with a kind of legal intervention to change that, but that situation should not need a legal intervention. That simply should not arise. So there is a real gap on the picking up of the vulnerability, and there is, I suppose, an element of overload, I think, with the housing authorities, that actually engaging with the individual family's needs, perhaps with the resources, is not feasible. But the attention of the committee on that area would be most welcome. Just with respect of solutions, you know, constitutional right to housing, we obviously support, and we see it as part of a host of measures, and the recommendations that we've made are set out in our substantive statement, and then I prioritised a few in response to Deputy O'Brien. But certainly the constitutional right as an enduring protection, just looking forward as an overarching protection to try and affect the whole range of statutory provisions that apply with respect to housing, because it isn't just about the homeless area, it's about the private rented, it's about the HAP, it's about the social housing, and we see that as a measure that would really influence all those different areas. And just to pick up on some of the points that Deputy O'Dowd made, the lack of urgency on the ground, I would absolutely share that concern, and I certainly am aware from very frequent engagements with housing authorities the exasperation of housing authorities with respect of bringing on stream more suitable emergency accommodation, and I believe there is a will there, and I haven't identified the exact blockages, but there certainly are blockages, because we're in a situation 2 years later where the majority of families within the Dublin region are in hotels, and we've very much focused just within the Dublin area, and it's been good to hear the experiences of outside Dublin, because we would have a number of contacts from outside Dublin where there is a much more ad hoc approach to provision of homeless accommodation. And there would be broad reliance on B&Bs and hotels. And we would have had a number of cases recently where families have had to be separated because they can't be all accommodated in one space. And obviously that is an interference of family life you know, compounds that chaos and distress of homelessness. And we welcome certainly your comments with respect to the right to housing and your support for the constitutional protection. And certainly, you know, there is no quality of life when you're all living in one room, be it in a stable booking or otherwise. And you know, I would be working with somebody at the moment who was in a one night only, and now she's in a one room with her 4 children, and the quality of life is simply not there. And the report that was published yesterday really had some very hard-hitting findings and some very emotive examples of the impact on young children in particular, and we would see that very frequently in our casework. So we welcome a call for sort of extra focus and energy, and there is an imperative to deal with this, and we would hope that there could be recommendations made from this committee to influence the policy more broadly. Thank you.
Dr Muldoon.
I'll just be fairly brief on a number of things. Just in relation to one of the questions you asked, Deputy Casey, was about whether deaf schools can cater for this better. I think I was at the Irish Primary Principals Network conference in January, and they had surveyed their members, so the principals, 3,000 primary school principals, 39% of them had interaction with homelessness. So that's every school every area in the country at least. They're all doing a fantastic job as best they can. They're the unsung heroes here who are catering for a lot of them, whether they bring in food to help the children at the breakfast time, whether they stay afterwards, whether they help them with their homework. I think the education sector is doing a phenomenal job without the levels of support that are needed on other areas of the ground, whether it's the child care support worker, whether it's the home liaison officer. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to support them. So I don't think it's just DESH. I think that's one of the things we need to recognise, and it's one of the things that came out very clearly from yesterday's report. Dr Nowicki said it's scary how close we all are to homelessness, and I think that's we need to move away from. It's not just disadvantaged areas, it's people with economic crisis. Family disruptions are causing people to fall into homelessness in a way that never happened before. We have situations like where Tipperary and Clare are now looking at family hubs, so that's homelessness in areas that we wouldn't have thought of before. You asked also is there anything else that hasn't been done? One of the things I'm concerned about is that we will go through this crisis, and somewhere along the line we will get enough houses, but we won't have changed the system so that the next crash that comes, children and families will still not be protected. So what we have to do is look at the rental system as well, so there's more security. People can consider themselves as lifetime renters if they need to. They can stay in the areas they want to be in. They've got some level of security like we have in every other country in Europe and America, where you can sustain your lifetime living as a family. And that's why I'm worried about family accommodations not being one of the priorities and housing. We need to show another way of going, because when we speak to the DRHE, they say that the only tool they have is HAP. And we know in lots of other parts of the country there are no rental accommodations coming. Limerick, Cork, Galway haven't got rental accommodation available to them. So you've got to have a wider sense of what's available to people. So I think it's thinking short term, it is going to be about providing accommodation, but we also got to use this crisis to make sure this never happens again. And that means widening the breadth of security for families, not necessarily owners, but also the renters for life. And that, whether that's in social housing or in the rental system. So the rental system hasn't changed that much. The biggest change has been that we now provide 6-month notice to people who are there for 5 years. That's a step forward, but it's not security. You know, in any other country in Europe, you can have people who've lived and rented all their lives in the one house. We need to provide that option into the future as well. So that's just thinking of the future. I think that's probably it.
I suppose just on your point, Deputy Casey, in our homeworks report, which was written by Dr. Ger Scanlon and Gráinne McKenna of DCU, so they did independent research with 20 different families. And I suppose one of the findings that they've made was that after talking to the parents about how their children experience school, was that schools are a place of sanctuary for those children, that we need to do everything we can to ensure that children can stay in the same school and have that routine, that security that they don't have while living in emergency accommodation. And yes, I think Dr. Muldoon has touched on it. There are quite a number of children in non-DEIS schools that don't have the same support. So DEIS schools are actually, it's not even that they have more resources, but they're more used to dealing with disadvantage. So they actually know what came out of the research, because they interviewed principals, teachers, SNAs, homeschool community liaison officers, and they knew where to go, whereas maybe those working in non-DEIS schools weren't as familiar with it, but principals were spending huge amounts of time writing letters to advocate on behalf of families, and that doesn't really make a difference. So they felt very frustrated by that. So one of the recommendations that we made in the homeworks report, which actually there was a debate earlier this year, and Minister McHugh came into the Dáil to talk about the report itself and the recommendations, and said that he would look at those and look at how those could be implemented, was that you would extend homeschool community liaisons to non-DEIS schools for a limited time period of maybe 3 years, so that they would all have those supports that they need, and that children who are in non-DEIS schools wouldn't fall through the cracks, really. Some of the other recommendations in that report were around extending July provision, which is usually for children with special needs. It means that children in homeless accommodation would have somewhere to go during the day, during the summer months, because that's a huge issue for them as well. Because if they're in emergency accommodation, you know, and especially if they're on one night only, they might have to go and wander the streets for a period of time. And you asked what can be done in the shorter term. I think some of the things that we've presented here could really help. Your own example of children going to Wicklow and having to come back to Dublin. If local authorities could just maybe look at where children are at school and when they're making decisions. I know it's, they're often at the mercy of where is available, but I think if there could be some system put in place to try and consider those things, and ultimately that the legislation would be changed, that, to place a duty on them to have to consider these things, that would make a huge difference. So I think those are some of the things that we would see, and that report we can forward that to you. I think it has been forwarded to the committee already, but we can send that again, because it does have quite a number of practical recommendations. And one of the things it did recommend was that the Department of Education would become part of the interagency group that's looking at these issues, and we're delighted now that that has actually happened, and we hope that that will make a real difference in terms of children's education.
Thank you, Ms. Brady.
Yeah, just very briefly, I just wanted to, on the point around one night only accommodation, I mean, we absolutely echo the calls of our colleagues in Mercy Law Centre. Just to give one illustrative case study that's come through one of our members, Bernardo's. There was a mother of 2 small children that uses our service. They have to travel 2 hours into the city every day with 1 child in the buggy. They had all of the family's belongings in 7 plastic bags attached to the buggy. And the small child that was in the buggy was wetting herself because she couldn't, she was being potty trained and she couldn't last the entire journey. I mean, I know we've heard a lot of stories, but I mean, it's just not right that, that we're facing this, and it just has to be prioritised. One other point to Deputy O'Dowd's point on the local level. We've heard that minorities are disproportionately affected in a lot of these cases, and particularly in terms of travellers. One thing that we've mentioned in our report card is around local authorities not spending money that they have for traveller accommodation. So while, say, in Budget 2019, the allocation to local authorities increased, we're seeing that they're not spending it. Only, say, in 2017, only half of the budget allocation was spent by local authorities. So what we'd be suggesting there is that they be sanctioned. That if money is there, it should be spent, particularly when children are living in really bad accommodation.
Thank you. I was slightly worried by Deputy Casey's question. I don't want it to be recorded that Focus Ireland said there were going to be 48,000 new house completions in 2023. I was quoting what the Department of Housing had told the Fiscal Advisory Committee. So looking at what other people have said in terms of the total amount of need, there's a general, I think, consensus. The SRI, IBEC all say that if we're not producing around 36,000 new housing completions every year, we're not meeting the new demand that's coming on. So I think in the government's predictions, which were in the Fiscal Advisory Committee, they're saying about 2022 we would meet that. But you're absolutely right. We mustn't think of this as when we meet that target, the figure is over, because each year for the last decade that we failed to meet that, all those households, not just families, but all households who were seeking a home and couldn't find one are waiting to come onto the market. And obviously those families, those households who are better resourced, more wealthy, are going to get the first additional things that come, all else being equal, unless we intervene. So if intervene in the market, so if we leave this up to the market, we know who's going to be at the back of the queue. Just again on clarifying a point, I think it's really important to say that our figure that Dee talked about yesterday and today, that 9% of the families, of the children that are on the Focus Ireland caseload, only 9% of them have a child support worker. That's very worrying. 100% of the other families don't have a child support worker. The 9% is the best in the class. There are no child support workers, as far as I'm aware, in the model that was rolled out on homeless hubs. Clearly, the families that don't have an adult caseworker or key worker don't have a child support worker. So for vast majority of children, nothing. And I think that really needs to be more. So I absolutely agree with the Children's Ombudsman, Niall, that we can solve that more quickly in the hubs, but we mustn't forget that the most vulnerable families are not in the hubs, would appear. On the own door accommodation, so to give 2 sort of examples, so the Focus Ireland ran, a place in South Dublin that some deputies would know well, and one in Limerick, which Focus Ireland was supporting families in. In one case in South Dublin, it's a block of apartments, and there's other blocks of apartments beside it, which are people's homes. So physically, it is exactly the same as a block of apartments nearby, which is actually somebody's home. And South County Dublin are using it as emergency accommodation. So it's a flat, an apartment with a key in the front door. You go in, and that's your unit. It's got its kitchen, its bathroom, and it's your own space. Similarly, in Limerick, a place that Limerick County Council are using there, it was actually apartments at the back of a hotel for some medium-term accommodation, and they took it over, and we're supporting families there. So the family has a key to their own door; they can go in. When we started providing support in those, the families were homeless. When they changed the designation, they no longer are counted as homeless, but they are still paid out of the homeless budget, and they still have support workers because they're homeless, and the expectations that they need to move out of homelessness are still there. So it is quite clearly a different form of accommodation, and it's a better form of accommodation. And we would say that we should be looking at own door accommodation as the way of providing emergency accommodation. But we'd also, it is clearly homeless. And so if you look at the atmosphere or the living circumstances in, say, the block in South Dublin, between the accommodation, which is everybody is a tenant and it's their home and they know they're there for either permanently if they own it or on a security, as to the place where it's homeless accommodation, then they know that they're not there for long and they've got to keep on looking. They're completely different places to live. They are just utterly different. And no matter how much support we put in to make it a better place to live, it's still homeless emergency accommodation. So just make the point again that I think if the Minister had sat down with us and said, look, we think that we should be counting families in this own door accommodation as a separate category to the others because it's different and we need to recognise where we're doing things better than others, we'd have saved a year of rowing. Right, we'd agreed to that, but he didn't sit down, didn't explain it. It was just a change, and I think that the far more collaboration on these issues is needed rather than the position we are now. In terms of the last set of questions that you're asking, which was about why the figures differ. So I'm not sure exactly which figures you're referring to, but I think what is at play there is flow and stock. So if you need to think of homelessness, and sorry, people will then say, you've been talking about this for a long time, but I always find this a useful image, to think of homelessness as a river, not as a pond, or to think of homelessness as people moving through a room and out of a room. So the figures that we were reporting here are the number of families in Dublin who became homeless now and entered formal homelessness. If a higher number of people leave, then the total number falls. So it is possible in the particular month that the number of families becoming homeless, newly homeless, rises, while the total number of families who are currently homeless falls, because Niamh and her team and others have been very successful in moving people out. But that leads you to your final question is, well, what can we do better? And I would say if we don't provide more homes, there is no solution. There is no solution to this problem without more homes. Some of the homes, as Deputy O'Dowd said, can come from homes that are currently empty and not used. And it is shocking that we've had this enormous figure out there for so many years that we're going to be a solution. And it's ones and twos that have come through. And we would say again that I think the Irish property owner reacts a bit more actively to penalties rather than to sticks rather than carrots, and some form of taxation or pressure to put people where they have to explain why they got the place empty rather than we have to go chasing them would be necessary there. So the question for Deputy Casey becomes while we're waiting for the housing, should we put it that way, how do we better manage it? And if you go back to the metaphor of the people moving through the room and the people moving out of the room, not everybody stays in the room for the same length of time. So you could have exactly the same inflow and exactly the same outflow and have a completely different mix of people in the room. And what's happening at the moment is the most vulnerable families are being left in the room for the longest period of time. So families who are large, families who are travellers, families, some of them from ethnic minorities, some of them move up very quickly, but some of them get trapped. People with all sorts of vulnerabilities are the ones who get left behind. And that's where you get this over 160 families over there for 2 years. And at the heart of that is not just the number of social houses we have, it's allocations. And so if we don't allocate our social housing to families who aren't going to get into the private rented sector, they are going to remain homeless and they are going to suffer, and their children are their lives are going to be made an absolute misery. And unless we get over the view that we can't allocate social housing to homeless families because in some way it'll, that this will encourage people to become homeless. Is there anybody who could read all these reports and listen to all the examples, who could genuinely, honestly believe that families are deliberately putting their children in the circumstances that have been described? And yet our public policy is driven by that belief. It is what drives public policy on homelessness is a public and political attitude that people are making themselves homeless and will make them less likely to be homeless if we make life more difficult for them. All the organisations here, Focus Ireland, believe families are much more likely to move out of homelessness if they're coping with homelessness and are supported, and take the pressure off them, allow them the possibility to make the options, and stop treating them as if they're somehow responsible for their circumstances.
Deputy Barry.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank all the organisations that are represented here. and all the representatives of the organisation who've come in to give their evidence this morning. We have the fastest growing economy in Europe, we're told, and the scandal of growing child homelessness in our midst. And I think it's the responsibility of the committee, and I think it's the responsibility of the government, to listen to the recommendations that are being made. There are many points that have been made, but clearly the points about a constitutional right to a home and the points about a major ramping up of the provision of social housing are points that I hope will be reported on by the media in the wake of the hearings this morning. I've been asked by my colleague, Deputy Boyd Barrett, to give his apologies. He had another commitment. I'm not going to put all my questions together. I'm actually going to do it in shorter bursts. That's how I intend to use my 10 minutes. So I'm going to start with a question for Mike. Right?
But we actually have 20 minutes left, and I was going to take yourself and Victor together. So if you want, I can take Victor first, and then you can do the bursts. Because I actually want to ask questions, but we're going to run out of time, so I won't get to ask questions either.
Well, I'm just going to use 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's okay, but I need to take Senator Boyhan at the same time as well.
So you want me to ask my questions together?
Please, if you don't mind. It's just when we've this volume of witnesses, by the time we get through everybody.
Okay, we'll do that so.
Thanks, Mick.
So the question relates to the figures that you commented on from the Department of Housing released yesterday about housing completions for 222 and 223. Right? Now, if I understand you correctly, what you are arguing is that in order to maintain homelessness at its current levels approximately, and child homelessness at its current levels approximately, that you need 36,000 housing completions per annum. Right? And if that figure is reached in 22, that would indicate that homelessness and child homelessness is set to rise for 2019, is set to rise for 2020, is set to rise again for 2021, and may be stabilised in the year 2022 before you see a fall in the numbers in 2023. Maybe I've taken you up wrong in that regard, but if we have, homelessness advocates and campaigners and experts coming before this committee and saying that the figures that the department released yesterday indicate that homelessness and child homelessness is going to rise year on year for the next 3 years, then that needs to be something which is part of the public debate that arises from the committee hearings this morning. So I'm asking you to comment as to whether I've gotten you right in relation to that. The second question then is, perhaps I'll address it to the representatives of the Mercy Law Resource Centre. Am I right in this, that if you are in family hub accommodation and within that accommodation you're part of the segment who use that accommodation who have their own door, that you are not counted as part of the official homelessness figures released by the Department of Housing? I want clarification on that, if you can comment. And when you say that a child who is homeless in this country is worse off than the child who is homeless in the UK because they have less legal protections, can you give us a couple of examples of what those lesser legal protections actually are? Where is the gap? For the representatives of the Children's Rights Alliance, family hubs, we have the positive of it being an improvement over what went before, but clearly speakers, and perhaps especially yourselves, have highlighted the potential negatives there and the danger of institutionalisation. Right? When we heard about family hubs being taken out on 5-year leases, we raised a warning in this committee about institutionalisation, because we've seen what that's meant in this state in the past for other vulnerable groups. And now we're hearing reports. I mean, what was said today about 3.5 years. Now, it wasn't in a family hub, but in hotel and B&B accommodation. Clearly, the dangers of institutionalisation in the family hubs is growing in the context of the figures that we've discussed today, and I'd like you perhaps to comment a little bit further on that. And then finally, a question for Niall Muldoon. You didn't make reference today, but I did notice before in previous interviews that you've done, you made a point which caught my attention, and I'd like you to comment on it. I think oftentimes when there's a focus on the damage done to children by homelessness, there's a focus on kids who are of school-going age, and the type of scenario that Pat has mentioned there about, you know, being late for school or not being able to go to school for a day or a week or whatever because of the distance that you're staying and the disruption to family life. But I read an interview that you did where you were speculating on the possibility that the level of damage that's done to very, very young children could be as great or even greater. I'm not a child psychologist, but my understanding of what you were saying was that just people sensing what is going on around them and the trauma that that causes to a very young child, and that you wouldn't know for decades as to how much damage has been done, how much trauma has been suffered, or what the consequences might be, or what the consequences not just for the individual but for society might be. And I want to invite you to make further comment on that if you would like to do so. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you, and I suppose conscious of time, I'm only going to ask one question and just make a few comments. Firstly, I want to acknowledge your presence and to thank you, all of you here today, because you are effectively advocates and you have given voice to so many homeless children and families that are effectively voiceless. And don't be disheartened, because I think I've heard all of you speak at different venues in the last few years, and I know you're constant advocates of people, particularly children. But it is I think previous speakers have said, it does make a difference, and it's a drip and tap, but eventually people cop on, and I just want to salute you for your work. I suppose I also want to I'm someone who's been involved in the establishment of the institutional redress scheme and have been very much involved in the early stages of lobbying for that. And I can see this situation as being our next redress scheme. The reality is children are now exposed to physical, mental and emotional and sexual abuse. They're unsafe. And I also met a woman who I've been working with for 3 years, who we flagged to people in Hickwa, in Wicklow County Council and a number of state agencies. And that woman today is still in emergency accommodation and in a hotel in Bray. That woman is constantly ringing me up every day, asking how can she meet someone, how can she get assistance. That is a woman that has major mental health issues and acknowledges and recognises it. That is a woman that has sat in the hall here of Leinster House with her daughter, and her daughter takes her hand and rubs it and says, "Mummy, stop crying. I'm here for you." A girl who's 14 years of age and is sat in this building crying and saying, "I'm here to support you." And when you ring up the particular council, they tell you she's a history and she's trouble. We all have a history and we all have troubles, and we need support and we need assistance. And I think one thing that's clear from what you've told us today, I've always believed it, we need joint up thinking. And we have HICWA, we have the Department of Education, we have the Department of Children and Health. And every time I contact one of these departments there, I'm telling you, it doesn't cover us. Or, we can't meet this particular person because she won't accept a place finder or meet the place finder because it's HAP. And she's had problems with HAP and she doesn't want to go into HAP. And it's all very sad and very traumatic for people. So I don't think there's a politician, a county councillor in this country that hasn't been touched by personal experience and people who've come to their clinics and their rooms. So I just think that's an important thing to say. And I think it's not surprising that we have a lack of child support and caseworkers. We had it in the childcare sector in the 70s and 80s and 90s. We saw the redress and what's dealt with. And the trauma and the trouble and the hurt and the pain and the suffering and the mental anguish and the anxiety and torture that children are undergoing. And we as a state that talk about a constitution and, cherish the children of the nation equally. We don't. This state does not cherish the children in this state equally, and it's exceptionally disappointing. And I suppose really to say that we all value our home, and our home is central to our dignity as a person. It is central to our dignity and our need, and defines who we are and secures us and gives us the capacity to integrate and mix and live in our communities. So it is critically important. And I want to say I fully support the constitutional right for housing, and I fully accept that the local authorities are not doing enough in terms of delivering social housing, which is really critical. And if you look back at what went on in this country in the 30s, 40s and 50s and 60s, we had programmes, we delivered houses, and there were people living in those houses that didn't come into them because of social need, but bought them subsequently. But they are beautiful homes, and I can tell you, many of them are out where I live in South County Dublin. So what have I learned? I already knew it, but what have I learned out of today? That we neither have a statutory nor a constitutional right to basic shelter or housing. That's a fact. You know, you said it again. We have no constitutional right to shelter for homeless children or families. We have no statutory right to the shelter of homeless children or families in this state. Isn't that a terrible thing? We have no legal aid for housing for homeless matters. That is a challenge. That's a really challenging matter. And I know the Ombudsman has raised this before, and I know your limitations. I think you know that yourself. But we've a serious issue there, and we need to look at it as important. Local authorities have a discretion, you said it there before, Rebecca, have a discretion, but no duty to provide emergency accommodation for children and families in the state. Isn't that a terrible indictment on our system and our state? So look, I don't need to teach you. I've learned some more from you today. But clearly the minutes of this meeting are going to be important. Clearly what we do as a result of your deliberations here today and our considerations is going to be important. And I ask you to keep the pressure on us and other people, and we in turn will keep the pressure on the political establishment in here. And finally, I want to wrap up by saying there are 81 constitutions that have special status and protection for children and mention it in their constitutions. And I'm particularly interested in the Scottish model. I've read a little bit about it. And I would ask you, that's my only question, I'd ask you, can you share with us your knowledge of other constitutional provisions for the protection of homes for children, the constitutional right for housing that we talk about in here, because I think it's a really, really important aspect, and I think it's something we need to recommit ourselves to. So for those or any of you who know about the Scottish model, perhaps you might share some of your understanding or some of your experience in relation to that. But finally, I go back to say, well done to you. You are the advocates. You shine a light in many dark places. We have that job and that task too, and I think we can work all together. But we would be failing today, both you and both me and us, if we don't go from here, analyse what's been said, paraphrase it and bullet point it, and get it to the Minister, but also to the Minister for Children, because as well as this being a housing and a homeless issue, this is about cherishing the children of our state equally, giving them the opportunities, giving them the safeguards, protecting them for the future, and allowing them to grow for their potential. But I finish on this, as I said in the beginning. These matters will be the subject of an international investigation in the future. I have no doubt about that. These matters will be the subject of the state being hauled up to account for their failures. These matters will be the subject of a very, very expensive redress scheme that has, because of the damage that this state is inflicting on children and families. But again, thank you for your time and sharing with us both your personal experience in terms of your caseloads and your work. I think it's a really, really important day's work, but it'll be a better day's work if we go from here committed to pulling all this together and leaping on the pressure on anyone that matters in terms of government policy. Thank you.
Thanks, Victor. We're going to be a little bit pressed for time now, so sorry about this. Ms Keating, I'll start with yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Barry and Deputy Boyhan, for your very welcome comments and questions. Just with respect of the figures, there was a question about do the own door accommodation that is subsumed within the family hub is that classified as family hub within the figures? Is it counted in the homeless figures? No, I don't know the exact answer to that question. I note that but Focus Ireland may be able to comment on it, so I would happily defer to Mike on that. I do note that the report of the Dublin Regional Homeless Sector from April does break it down. So you have hotels and B&Bs, private emergency accommodation, supported temporary accommodation and family hubs. So I don't know the exact answer to that. We would have concerns about the integrity of the data since these categories have been taken out, and we would have concerns about the categories that were never included, so those in refugees, those rough sleeping, and that would have been documented in our statement. So I may defer to Mike with respect of that. Then the question was also with respect of what is different for a child who is homeless in Scotland, say, compared to Ireland, and that question was also raised by Dr. Boyhan, so I can address the difference between the models. I mean, at present, if you're homeless in Ireland and you're a child, you don't have any statutory protections, essentially. You have this discretionary, there's a discretionary obligation on the local authority to provide emergency accommodation. The local authority has to assess you for homelessness, but the legislation very clearly says that you can be homeless if you're found to be such in the opinion of the local authority, and that is a huge challenge. And just by way of examples, and we talked about the refusals, and I didn't address that full on, Deputy Casey, but these are people who repeatedly present as homeless. They have come maybe with a notice of termination that hasn't been validated by Threshold, who's the regular agency. They haven't provided sufficient paperwork, which is normally extensive and is paperwork that's normally associated with social housing assessment. They haven't stayed with every family member who they could possibly stay with to meet their housing need. And what we would have seen quite recently is families who are repelled repeatedly, really, from housing authorities when they present. I'm somebody who would have presented in around 12 times, and now there's been an intervention, then there's a recognition that there is no alternative, and there would be young children in that case. So there is no duty on the housing authority to assess that and to take into account the best interests of those children. And just to look at the different models, so what is different really between the Irish model and, say, the English and the Scottish model? With respect to the English model, one thing that's particularly noteworthy is that there are limits on the time vulnerable categories of person, including homeless families, can spend in unsuitable temporary accommodation, such as hotels and B&Bs, and that time limit is 6 weeks. Now, in Scotland, the time limit is 7 days, and that was brought down from 14 days. Okay, so that is quite a phenomenally stark difference to the situation here for a child in Ireland who would be accessing homeless services. Just to add to that with respect to the legal framework, there's a best interest consideration that is completely absent here. And in the Scottish model, I mean, that is seen as a model that has really brought about a very different approach to homelessness, a human rights-led approach, but it is with respect to homelessness, and the criticisms of that is that they need a broader right to housing. And that is one of the criticisms of even this kind of model, as it were. So we would very much welcome that model, but we do recognise that there are shortcomings brought, and that highlights then the need for a broader protection of the right to housing. So I'll let others respond. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I suppose I'll address the question specifically from Deputy Barry in regards to the impact on children in the younger age group. I mean, my background is psychology, but the first 1,000 days of children is now considered so much more critical than it ever has been before. It relates to the plasticity of the child's brain and the impact of trauma, and the trauma could be the insecurities, uncertainties, and that they pick up on the tensions and the fears that the parents have as a young infant. That's very clear. That can impact on their feeding, can impact on their development of potty training, it can impact on their physical movement, it can impact on their security and sense of who they are as an individual, as a child, and excessive attachment. We know that children, from the consultations we had, some parents are just literally strapped. The child will not let them out of their sight for fear that they will lose them. Then they're also the system also forces them not to allow them out of their sight, so there's no sense of allowing that independence to happen, to even let them go away with their older brother or sister. That's not allowed to happen. And the impact on the psychological basis is very, very stark now, and the research is showing that in those first 1,000 days up to your third birthday, that's the most important period of time in which you get a sense of yourself. And it can be overcome at a later stage, but it's much, much more difficult to achieve that. So there are impacts there, and we see and we hear from examples of children literally being born into that situation. You know, you can imagine the impact on it if a child is premature, 4 weeks premature, and has been pushed around a shopping centre for that time. They are still picking up on feelings and emotions and sense of security that mother has or that parent has. So there is a huge impact to be had from that point of view. And I think as we find ourselves going more towards what you call institutional, long-term stays in these emergency situations, we will see more of those children impacting and acting out challenging behaviours, criminal behaviours perhaps in the future. Who knows what the impact could be? And that's the point, it's uncertain. But we now are long enough in this situation to find that we will have children who will probably have spent 3 and 4 years in those sort of circumstances from birth, not just as teenagers. That's going to be a huge impact on us, and I think we as a society need to see that and change that in the future. You know, they've gone through that. We need to make sure that we can protect them into the future. And then the one other comment I want to make on Deputy Boyhan was just that interdepartment thing and the sense. I think if we move our public agencies to start looking at the child at the centre of this, that takes away the focus from that troublesome parent, that tricky parent, that challenging parent. I've had mothers who come to me who know they're defined within the public service as a psycho mum, and they have to be. And that's where the problem is. We're making them have to work in that way. But if we put the child at the centre of this decision making, that should take away the pain and the fire around those issues. So I think it's something we need to work towards in the long term.
Thank you, Dr. Muldoon. Ms. Brady.
Just on the institutionalisation point, I suppose when you take people's autonomy away, and even if they're in family hubs, which are better than emergency accommodation, some of those family hubs, they may not have cooking facilities, they may not have, you know, access to the range of things that they need. You know, I know in the OCO's report, there was one little girl who talked about how she couldn't go downstairs to do her homework in the one room that was available to her because she would have had to bring her entire family with her. So children and teenagers aren't getting that independence, they aren't feeling that autonomy, and parents aren't either, and that is going to cause long-term damage. And I'll give you an example of a number of stories that we've heard from members and from others. In our homeworks report, there was a little boy who was in an earlier setting, and every day when they went to go for outdoor play, he got really upset when he had to go and put his coat on because he didn't understand what was happening, and he actually thought he had to go back to the hotel. So he would throw a tantrum, he'd get really upset, and it took the childcare workers a bit of time to work out what was happening. But then when they got it out of him, he said, it's because I'm going home, I'm going to the hotel. And they said, no, you're not. That same child wouldn't speak or eat in the hotel. So thankfully, there was a hot meal given in the creche for him. And, you know, they did great work and he was able to socialise with other children. But another member told us about a child who was having huge difficulty walking. They were about 3 years old. They weren't able to walk and they couldn't understand why, and they had to go to physio. And it became apparent the reason that they couldn't walk was because their muscles in their legs hadn't developed, because they're in a buggy all day, because their mum has to push them around because she has nowhere to go while she's waiting to go back into accommodation that night. And then there was a good news story from our homeworks report. Angela, one of the mothers who spoke with the researchers, spoke at an event in DCU and talked about how she now has been given a home, and it's great. And she talked about how the first night that they were there, she said there were so many people calling round because the children could finally say that they had a place to call home, could have their friends around. So there were multiple knocks at the door, they were all stampeding towards it. But one of the really kind of heartbreaking things that she talked about was the fact that she made them dinner, she made them mash and sausages, you know, for the first time in 2 years, and she broke down and started crying just because she'd been able to cook a meal for them. She has 4 children, 2 of them are under the age of 6. They still crawl into bed with her at night because they're not used to having their own space. They share a room, but their mum isn't there anymore. The 5 of them shared a room for so long, they're not used to this. So she's finding that quite difficult as well. She finally has her own space and the children are coming into her. So those are just some of the ways children and young people are being institutionalised. But I think if you read the OCO's report, you hear from children themselves about what they feel being in family hubs is like. Some describe it as a prison, some describe it as trying to escape. So we really need to look at that and listen to those voices of children and see what we can do for them. And just the one thing I would add on the Scottish model, Senator Boyhan, is that I think Rebecca has given a very clear overview of what the differences are there. But one of the things Scotland is looking to do at the moment is incorporate the Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law. And that would, make a huge difference. We had a referendum here in 2012, which came into effect in 2015, and we have incorporated some of those rights, the best interest of the child, the voice of the child, in certain proceedings. But we need to do more if we're really going to do, do the rights of children justice. So I suppose that's something I think you could look at, what's happening in Scotland and how they're looking to incorporate that further.
Thank you, Ms Brady. Mike?
Deputy Barry, in the broadest possible general terms, yes, you have correctly understood me. I've never seen figures that far out, the 2023 figure, predictions from government about how many houses they would build. So that was why maybe I'd missed something, maybe people are watching that more closely. So it's just drawing to people's attention, that's where the government says it's going to go, and yet we know each year where the demand is, and that's the first time you've got some sort of government indication of where that might shift. Some really serious caveats about it. The first one being, do we believe that we're going to 48,000 by 2023? But more importantly than that, or equally as important to that, is the question of just because there's a mismatch in the amount of housing supply and the people who need it, doesn't necessarily turn into homelessness. In the formal, measured sense, it can turn up as doubling up or overcrowding or a whole range of things. And that's quite divided by social class and resources. So, for instance, if you were delivering 48,000 homes by 2023 and the majority of those were affordable and social housing, you probably would have seen a decline in homelessness a lot earlier. But if the majority of that was, as it were, market-led and therefore at the top of the market, you probably wouldn't even see a turnaround in homelessness until significantly after that. So that mix of price and tenure and where will be absolutely crucial, not just in the numbers. On your question about own-door accommodation, my understanding is that the most significant change that the Department of Housing made to the measurement of homelessness was that they stopped counting within those official figures families who were accommodated in housing units where people had their own key to the door. So they're no longer counted in those official homelessness figures. And at your own committee, when you discussed this before, I think it might have been you, Deputy Barry, you asked the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive who considered such families to be homeless, and they said yes. And you asked the Department of Housing whether they considered them to be homeless, and they said no. So they are not homeless as far as the figures are concerned, but they are homeless even in the own-door accommodation in terms of getting support from people like us and being paid for. So it's a complicated area. Obviously, it changes the total number, but if people aren't impressed by them being 10,000, they're not going to be impressed by them being 11,000. So the more significant difficulty that raises is it makes it much harder to understand what's happening. So a family becomes homeless, and if they're in a hotel, they're counted as homeless. If they're moved into own-door accommodation, they cease to be counted as homeless, but they're not counted as having moved out of homelessness. So you get to a situation, you just really find it very hard to track what is going on, what direction that things are going, and that makes a big difference if you want effective policy. On the issue of the family, on the impact on children, I think there are just 2 points I'd like to make on that. In our own research that we did, where we talked to families that had moved out of homelessness, and we asked the parents about the impact of homelessness on the children, the parents tended to say it hadn't affected the younger children, right? They said, no, it affected the older children, not the younger children. I don't think we should be taking that on face value, but I think it actually indicates a much more serious problem in that the parents aren't therefore positioned to address the trauma that might have happened to the younger children because they didn't think they noticed it. So I think actually, rather than being a reassurance, the fact that the parents see that in that way is actually a greater cause for concern in terms of the long-term implications for those families. And we mentioned in the report that we're doing some work collectively with others on the trauma on children, and that we're happy to share that with the committee if they're interested. On the Scottish model, just a couple of quick points. First of all, as you know, the response in Scotland is a legal right to housing rather than a constitutional right. They don't have a constitution, so there's nowhere to put it. But and that had the impact. If you look at the history of how that has impacted, you can see the importance not just of the legal right, but political leadership and I would argue political consensus. And in the early stages of that, there was a really transformative moment where all the political parties right across the board were supported and it was led very clearly. And that drifted away. Now, there's an attempt to re-establish that with a new strategy, which will be very welcome. But that sense that there was a cross-party, left, right, nationalist, unionist, whatever they call themselves, consensus that one of the things they were going to do right in Scotland was housing and homelessness was really important. There's a very useful PhD written by a great researcher called Beth Watts, comparing attitudes and responses to homelessness in Scotland and in Ireland. Direct response in terms of the homeless service, which is well worth looking on that. And also then to say, in terms of families, you get the situation in Edinburgh is very, very different than the situation in Glasgow. So the overarching position obviously is the same, but the way it plays out in the two major cities is very, very different. And it's to do with what they did with their social housing stock. One of the cities gave all their social housing stock essentially to the approved housing bodies and don't no longer have control over it and are trying to catch it back. And the other one held on to their housing. And very, very different responses in those cities. So there's a lot to be learned from what Scotland has done in terms of how we should be responding. They don't have the same scale of family homelessness problem that we have. So there are limitations to what you can do because they don't. The scale that we are seeing is unique to us in Europe. It's similar to what you might be seeing in the United States, but it's not comparable to anything in Europe. So we have to some extent, find our own solutions.
Great. Thanks, Mike. On behalf of the members, can I thank all the witnesses for attending today. I think we've all found it really interesting, and we'll obviously be able to develop something from that. So can I thank you very much for your attendance today. Members, this meeting is now adjourned. The next meeting of the Joint Committee will be held on the 18th of June at 11 a.m. and it's on affordable housing.